If you caught my previous video on this project where we overcame some of the static limitations of conditional formatting, link is up in the corner and in the video description. We saw where we gave the user some drop-down lists with data validation where they could choose between either some top or bottom ranges or n values versus percentiles, and then they could type in some number and the data validation would react to this. Well, in this video, we're going to improve this user interface. So this video is going to show us how we can use option buttons to select between the top and the bottom, as well as the n value versus the percentage. But you can also see how we're getting different conditional formatting, whereas we're getting green for the top percentage and red for the bottom percentage. Also notice we're getting dynamic titles, so we can get top percent, bottom percent, but we can also get top n, bottom n. We have a spin button control over here where the user can use this to increase or decrease the value instead of having to type in the number. We'll also build in some error checking, so if the user were to type in a percentage over 100%, they'll get an error. But likewise, if they put in an n value that's greater than the number of values in the data set, they'll get a different kind of error. And since every number entered has to be a positive number, we'll also put in some data validation. So if the user puts in something like a negative value, then they'll get an error message, but we want that to be a custom error message. So this is really going to be more of a project. The main features used in the construction of this project are going to be define named ranges, the creation of a single select interface, these will be the option controls, an increase-decrease interface, and this will be with the spin button, all of the built-in sideline logic that we used in the prior project, like if, large, small, percentile, and count, VLOOKUP, and if error, but we'll have to rewrite these functions because of some of the ways the users will be inputting their choices. We'll also look at some custom dynamic titling, error checking, conditional formatting, and custom data validation. All of these features can be used in a wide variety of different projects, so seeing them working here together might give you some inspiration on how you can use them in your projects. You can download the files for this project via the link in the video description. This way you can have the starter file and follow along with the video, build it as I build it, or you can just open up the solution file and see how everything was done. I've got full documentation in both of these files, so that way you can print this out and use it as a checklist and see every formula and every feature that I used and created. So let's jump into the project. We begin the project by activating the developer ribbon. Now this ribbon is off by default, but by turning it on, you'll get access to some of the higher functions in Excel. To do this, right-click anywhere on the tabs or ribbon area and choose Customize the Ribbon. In this right side panel, I'll scroll down and just put a check next to Developer, hit OK, and now we have the Developer ribbon. The next thing we'll do is give our range of data a name. The reason for this is we'll have to highlight these numbers for various things like conditional formatting, but also for a lot of the formulas we write. So since this is a proper table, I'm going to highlight the headings, go all the way from January to December. We'll go up to the name box, and we'll call this sales. So this is just like what we did in the prior video. So now if we ever need to point to this information, we can just say sales, and there it is. Now it's time to create the option buttons for the top and bottom range selection. To do this, we'll go up to Insert, and we're going to be using these form controls. Now, form controls come in two flavors. There's the legacy form controls, the ones here at the top, and then the ActiveX form controls, the ones at the bottom. Most of these controls are duplicated in both legacy and ActiveX, but the difference is the ActiveX gives you more flexibility, but in some cases requires some background coding. Since we don't need any of the complexity or the advanced features, the legacy form controls will be better because they'll be simpler. So we'll start by adding an option button. So I'll click the option button option, and then we'll just drop that button right here. Now we're going to need two of these, one for the top and one for the bottom range selection. So we'll go back up to Insert, click Option button, and drop a second one right below. Now the names of these option buttons are irrelevant. We're going to rename them. But I want you to notice a behavior here. If I pick option button number 1, it's selected. But if I pick option button number 2, option button number 1 becomes deselected. Because with option buttons, you can only ever have one selected at a time. So these will work as a pair. Now you can add more option buttons and they'll all work as a team. But at some point, we're going to need two option buttons, one for the top-bottom range, and another set of option buttons for the top end and the percentage. We don't want all four of them working together. We'll need to split them up as two separate teams or two separate sets of option buttons. But before we do that, let's take care of some simple customizations. To rename these, if you right-click on an option button and choose Edit Text, then I'll rename this to Top, and then I'll right-click on the bottom one, Edit Text, and I'll rename this one to Bottom. Because our upcoming formulas will need to know which one of these the user has selected, we have to be able to store that selection information somewhere, and that's where the range input cell in O10 is going to come into play. So if I right-click on one of these option buttons and choose Format Control, for the cell link feature, I'm going to point to cell O10, hit OK, and now with top selected, range input is set to a value of 1. But if I choose bottom, range input is now set as a value of 2. So our formulas will have to detect whether range input is a 1 or a 2. Now it's time to set these up as a team. Here's a tip for you when working with these form controls. If you want to select a form control, but you want to select it for things like moving, resizing, customization, if you hold down your control key and click the form control, it will select it without activating it. So in this case, I could take this and I can move it. And if I were to continue to hold down control, I could select both of these objects. And I could do something like go to shape format, align, and I'll align them on their left edge. So to get these two to be identified as a set, an exclusive set, we're going to go back up to developer, insert, and in the legacy form controls, we're going to choose this one right here called a group box. So when I click that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a rectangle around those existing form controls, and when I release, anything that's within that group box is considered a team. I'll rename this group box, so right-click Edit Text, and we'll rename this to Range. I'll do a little resizing, and because I want the range bounding box and the option buttons to travel as a team, I'll hold down Control, select every object in this set, and then do something like a right-click Group. And so now this is a single object. I'll just place it over here for now. Now we need a second set of option controls to allow the user to choose between an N value and a percentage input. So let's just repeat this process. We'll go to Insert, Option Button. I'll drop one here. Insert, Option Button, drop a second one. I'll rename them, right-click Edit Text. We'll call this one N value, right-click Edit Text, and I'll call this one Percentage. I'll move them close together, select both of them by holding down Control, align them, and then we'll go up to Insert and use that group box to draw a rectangle around them, and that way they're known as a selected team. Rename the group box, and we'll call this grouping. Now, N value and percentage need to store that same 1, 2 option selection somewhere, and we're going to store that information here in cell O13. So I'll right-click on N value, Format Control, and for cell link, we'll point to O13. Hit OK, and now to test this, if I choose N value, we get a 1. If I choose percentage, we get a 2. But that doesn't change the range input. Range input is still controlled by top and bottom. It's those group boxes that define these as separate sets of option buttons. I'm going to hold down Control, select this group, do a little resize. We'll get it close. But then I'll hold down Control and select all of the objects and do a right-click group. And we'll put this over here. Now for the spin button, so the user can use that to enter their N value or percentage value. So we'll go up to Insert, and I'm going to choose this object right here called a spin button, and I'll just draw it roughly right about here. Now I can take this and move this, I can resize this, but here's another tip for you. If you hold down your Alt key while you're moving, then it will lock into specific cell intersections. So points on the grid where there's a cell intersection, it will lock into those corners. Same thing if you're doing resizes. So I've locked the height to rows 3 and 4 using the Alt key, but I don't need it this wide, so I'll just freehand position this to about here. And that's just what looks good to me. Like the option buttons, the spin button has to have a place to store the selected value, and that place is going to be here in cell H4. So I'll right-click on the spin button, Format Control, and we'll go to Cell Link and point to H4. Now the lowest value we will allow on the spin button is 0, and the highest value is 30,000. I'd like to be able to make that number higher to like 100,000 or maybe even 1,000,000, but the spin button maxes out at 30,000, so that will have to do. So we'll leave all these other values the way they are. I will turn off 3D shading. I'm just not a big fan. Hit OK. And now to test this, as I click the up button, I can increase the value. If I click the down button, I can decrease the value. And of course, if I just sit on one of those buttons, I can increase it or decrease it automatically. So we'll just set this to 20. So to recap what we built, the user can now select a top or bottom range. Their grouping can be based on N value or percentage, and then that percentage or N value can be set using this spin button. Now we're at the point where we have to write revised formulas to do the sideline calculations. Since I'm going to be pointing to cell O10 and O13 often in these formulas, I'd like to give them names. So for O10, we're going to name this range. And for O13, I'm going to leave that one alone. only because the next calculation coming up is what's actually going to be used in the following calculations. So for cell Q13, I'm going to name this cell N_perc for N value percentage. Now, if you remember from the prior video, if the user selected N value and their input was 20, we want that 20 to come in as an integer. But if they choose percentage, we want that 20 to come in as a fraction. So we had to write a little if statement over here on the side that says if the user selects N value, in other words, if this cell, O13, is equal to 1, then we want to take the value that the user has placed in cell H4. But if O13 is equal to a 2, which means they selected percentage, then we want to take H4 and divide it by 100. So now if it's percentage, the user put in 20, it comes in at 20%. But if they choose N value, it comes in as the integer 20. Now into the main calculations. First, the large and the small. So in cell O19, we're going to write an if statement, and we're going to ask if the range is equal to 1, so that means they selected top. Then we want to use a large function to scan all of sales, and the K value will be that sideline calculation here in Q13 that we called NPerc. Close parentheses, but if range was equal to 2, which means they selected bottom, then we want to use a small function to scan sales and also look at NPerc. Close parentheses for the small, close parentheses for the if. So with 20 selected, the top would be 1961. That would be the top 20th value. But if I choose bottom, it's negative 467. That would be the bottom 20th value. Now on to the percentile calculation. So just like in the previous video, we're going to use a percentile exclusive to look at sales, but then say if the range cell is equal to 1, then take 1 and deduct the value located in NPerc. Otherwise, just take the value in NPerc. Close parentheses for the if, close parentheses for the percentile exclusive. Now notice we're getting an error here because you can't feed an integer into the percentile function. But if I change the grouping to percentile, then our sideline calculation here translates that into a fraction. And now percentile works, and we can see by setting this to bottom, $10 would be the beginning of the 20th percentile. But if we set this to top, 1501 would be the beginning of the top percentile. Now also notice that when we have percentage selected in our grouping, large small turns into an error, but percentile works. If we choose N value, large small works, but percentile fails. But that's okay because we're only going to look at one of these two options at any point in time. Now to make that selection, that's where the cutoff formula comes into play. This is what we'll choose between the large small calculation or the percentile calculation. So for this, we'll write another if, and we'll just say if cell O13 is equal to a 1, that means they selected N value, we'll take whatever's in the large small cell, which is O19. But if they selected 2, which means they picked percentage, then we'll take whatever is in O22. Close parentheses, enter. So if N value is selected, we take the large small, and this is going to be what's fed to conditional formatting. But if they pick percentage, then we'll take whatever's in percentile and send that to conditional formatting. Since we're going to be referring to this cutoff cell in our upcoming conditional format formulas, we'll go ahead and give this cell the name of cutoff. Now it's time to apply conditional formatting to all of these values. So we'll begin by selecting our sales range, go to conditional formatting, new rule, and we'll use a formula. Now the formula will test to see if range, which is cell O10, is equal to a 1. Because if it is, then that's top. But if it's a 2, then it's bottom. So we'll say equals if range is equal to 1. Then look at cell B8 and test to see if it's greater than or equal to the cutoff. Now because I labeled B8 as a relative reference, when conditional formatting walks through the sales, it will examine each cell separately. So in this case, is cell B8 greater than or equal to 1501? We don't need a false part for the if because if the range equals 1 is false, we're not going to do anything anyways. So we'll just close this off. The format for this, we'll go to fill and give it something like a light green. Hit OK, hit OK. So now scrolling up to test this, if it's set to top and 20%, if we increase the input number with the spin button, then more cells fall into the percentage. So it's the top 50% or the top 50. Let's do the same thing for the bottom 50%, but we'd like those to be in red. So we'll go back and select sales, go to conditional formatting, new rule, use a formula. But this one is almost just like the other. We'll just say equals if range is equal to 2. If it is, take cell B8 and test to see if it's less than or equal to cutoff. There's no false for the if, but the format for this one, I'm going to go with this red, but that's a bit dark. So I'll go to more colors and I'll just fade it out a little bit. Hit OK, final OK, Now to test this, if we select top 50%, we get green. If we choose bottom 50%, we get red. So top is green, bottom is red. If I lower the value, fewer cells count as red. So that could be the bottom 32% or the bottom 32. So I'll do top 20%. Now how about we create a dynamic title so the user knows whether they've selected top or bottom or an end value or a percentage, but they don't have to look over at the controls to figure this out. So in cell H3, we'll write the ever popular if, but this will test to see if the range is equal to a 1. It's a little hard to see in that blue, so if you look in the formula bar, it's a little easier to see it up here. But if range is equal to 1, we'll write the word top. But if it's not a 1, we'll write the word bottom. But then we'll concatenate to that a space, so double quote, space, double quote, but then concatenate to that another if statement that says if O13, and that is where the end value percentage option button answer is stored, if that's equal to a 1, then we'll put the letter N, but otherwise we'll put a percent sign, close parentheses. So I've got top selected, I've got percentage selected, so this says give me top percentage. But if I choose bottom, then I get bottom percentage. If I choose N value, I'll get bottom N, and if I choose top, I'll get top N. So this if statement right here allows me to go through all 4 of the combinations for the dynamic title. Now, one of the things you should always be thinking about when you're building spreadsheets that other people are going to be using is try to anticipate all of the bad things they might try to put into your spreadsheet so you can build in a countermeasure to tell them that they've done something wrong and maybe even tell them what they should have done. So like in the case of this input cell, if the user chooses percentage and they type in a number greater than 100, we want them to know why they're not getting a result because you can't feed something over 100% to a percentile function. Likewise, if they choose N value and they put in a value that is greater than the number of items in their data set, like 10,000, I don't have 10,000 items in this data set, I'm not going to get an answer. But the user might not realize what they've done wrong because maybe they meant to type in 100 and they just have a sticky key. So what I'd like to do is I would like to have some error messages displayed in this section here, letting them know what they've done wrong. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to highlight these cells and I'm going to merge them together and engage the wrap text feature because this is where my messaging is going to go. I'm going to scroll over to the side here and I'm going to write the messages that will be displayed if needed. So for this first message I'll write, please select the percentage between 0 and 99. Now I need some sort of flag or indicator to be able to know whether to display that message or not. There are 2 things that have to occur in order for that message to hit the screen. One is the value entered here in H4 has to be greater than 99, and the value here in O13 has to be a 2 because then we know they're working with percentages. And that way if they're over 99%, we want to display this error. So we're going to use a combination of an if function with a nested and function. So we'll start off with an if, and then for the test, we'll launch into an and. The first test for the and will be to see if the user input cell is greater than 99, and if the option button selection in O13 is equal to a 2. Close the and. If both of those things are true, I want to display a 1. If neither of those or only one of them are true, I want to display a 0. Close parentheses. So if the user selects percentage and the value entered is over 99, I see a 1. But if they're choosing N value, I'll see a 0 because there could be 10,000 items in this list. Now for the second error message, what if they've selected N value, but the number they've typed in is greater than the number of items in my data set? So for this message, I'm going to put, please select a value less than the total number of sales entries. The only thing I need to check is if the user input in H4 is greater than the number of items in the sales named range. So we're going to start off with an if and just check to see if H4 is greater than, and we'll use a count function to count the number of entries in the sales named range. So if H4 is greater than the count number of sales, then as before, display a 1, otherwise display a 0. And as you can see, the user has selected N value. Let me scroll over a little bit. We've selected N value, and I typed in 10,000. I don't have 10,000 entries in this. In fact, if I hover over this formula, I can see there are only 1,620 entries. So anything over that value should display a 1. So if I put in 2,000, it's still a 1. But if I put in 1,000, then it goes to 0, because I can pick 1,000 items from a list of 1,600. Now we write the formula here in this gray box to decide which of those 2 error messages to display if they're needed. Now, since only one of these can ever resolve to a 1 at any moment in time, we can just run a lookup function on this and just say, hey, if a 1 is detected in this first column, then return whatever's in this second column. So as long as the user's not violating any rules, both of these are 0, no messages are displayed. Then we'll use a VLOOKUP to just look up the number 1 in this range of cells here, S10 through T11. And if a 1 is detected, bring back something from the second column. For the range lookup argument, we'll use false. Close parentheses. Now we get an NA here because we're not in violation of anything. Now we'll make this better, but to test it out, if they choose N value and we put in a number greater than the number of items in our sales data set, then we get the please select the value less than the total number message. But if we choose percentage and we pick a number greater than 99, then we get a different error message. Notice how both of those message triggers are 1, but we're only getting one of the messages, and it's the correct one. Let's change this top percentage to something like 150. So when you're set as a percentage, it's 150. Only one of these messages will be triggered. But if you set it to N value and put in a value over the number of items in the list, then again, messages only has one thing that's triggered. But if you have a number greater than the number of items in the set, which also happens to be greater than 99, both of those messages are going to get triggered. But because of the order we put them in, VLOOKUP is going to stop on the first one. And I don't mean the first item in the list, I mean the first one that's flagged as a number 1. So it's important to get these in the order that I have them placed. That way you won't get a false message when both of these are triggered. Now, if the value entered by the user does not trigger either of the error messages, like if I put in 50%, I don't want to see this #NA in the error message window. So we'll go back to this cell, and we'll wrap this VLOOKUP inside of an if error function. And we'll just say that if this is an error, which means there are no errors going on, we'll display nothing. So if there is an error, I'll see this type of message or this type of message. Let's now apply some conditional formatting to this message box because the user might not notice the message there, so we want to get their attention. So we'll use conditional formatting to have a formula look at these two cells. So if we see a 1 in cell S10, then I'd like to color the message cell red. But if I see a 1 in S11, I'd like to color the message cell blue. So let's go to the message cell. We'll go to conditional formatting, new rule, use a formula. Now here's something interesting to think about conditional formatting. Conditional formatting is all about asking a question and resolving it to either true or false. So what most people do is they'll say equals, and they'll point to a cell, like in this case S11, and they'll say, does that cell equal 1? And if it does, I'll go ahead and give it bold italic white font with a dark red background. And now you can see how I've got this red cell. But the thing is, that formula doesn't need to be that complicated. And I know you're thinking, well, that's not a very complicated formula. We're just checking to see if a cell equals a 1. Well, if you remember in Excel, a 0 is considered false and any other number is considered true. And since all conditional formatting is looking for is true or false, we can just say equals and then just point to the cell. And whatever's in there will give us a true or false response. So the way you'd read this is equals true. Now, if it's a 0, it would read equals false. So we'll hit OK again, and you can see it still works the same way. So you don't actually have to check for 1. You can just say, what is it? It's almost as if there were the words true and false in these cells. Now, I just realized I got my colors backwards on that one. So in this case, when we're checking for the N value error, I wanted to make that fill blue. Hit OK, hit OK, hit OK. So now on that same set of merged cells, we'll create another new rule based on a formula, and we'll just say equals and point to S10, because that will be for the percentage violation. And for this one, I'll give it the deep red fill. Bold italic, white font, hit OK, hit OK. So if I violate the percentage rule, I get a different message and the color of the cell is red. If I violate the N value rule, then the color of the cell is blue. Now we're almost at the finish line. One of the last things I'd like to do is this top N value where the user entered in the number. I'd like conditional formatting to have this cell mimic the same visual appearance as the error message. So we'll go to conditional formatting, new rule, use a formula. And the formula for this is going to be equals is the value of the user's entered number greater than the count of sales. And if it is, then I'm going to give it a bold italic white font with a strike through and a blue fill. Hit OK, hit OK. So if I type in something like 200, no conditional formatting. I type in 5,000 and I get the blue fill with the strike through. Now, same thing for when I'm exceeding the percentage. When I go over 99%, I want that same bold italic white strike through font, but with a red background. Now, this formula is predicated on two conditions. One, that the value entered by the user here is over 99. And two, the value in this cell, 013, is equal to a 2, because that tells me they selected the percentage option in the grouping box. So back here in the user input cell, we'll go to conditional formatting, new rule, use a formula, and the formula for this will be equals and the first test will be to see if the user entered value is greater than 99, and the second test is to see if cell O13 is equal to a 2. Close parentheses, we'll go to format and give it the red fill. Go to font, bold italic, white font, strike through, hit OK, hit OK. So if I put in 100%, I get an error. If I put in 99, no error. If I go to end value, no error because 99 is well under the total count of sales items. But if I did 5,000, we get the blue strike through. Since both of these tests are looking for numbers less than, like the count of items, or less than 99, what if the user puts in a negative value? Like what if I put in negative 500? It's not a valid entry for an end value or for a percentage, but we're getting no error. Any number entered by the user needs to be a positive number. Let's use data validation to ensure that anything put here has to be greater than 0. So we'll go up to data, data validation, and we'll just say that the number has to be a whole number greater than 0. Hit OK. So if I put in negative 500, I get the error. Now this message is not very informative. It does let me know that I've done something wrong, but I don't know what I did wrong. So let's customize this message. We'll go to cancel. Going back to data validation, we'll go over here to the error alert tab. And the title for this, I like to put a lot of asterisks and then something like input error, because this is what will go in the title bar. You don't have a lot of room, so you keep it concise. But then in the error message, you can write anything you want. We've got our message. We'll hit OK. So now if we go to this cell and we violate the rule, like -5, we get a custom input error message. I'll hit cancel. If I try to put in a 0, nope. But if I put in a 1, I can do that. Who's in the 1%? This guy. Now just some final cosmetic touches. I would end up hiding all of these columns. So right-click hide. In fact, in the real world, I would have put those on a different sheet and hidden that sheet. We'll go back to the beginning of the spreadsheet. The error input cell I colored gray just so we could see that that's where the error was going to go. But in the real world, I would probably not have a color applied to those cells. We'll go up to View, turn off our headings, and now we have our finished product. So if I wanted to do 20%, top N, I get green, bottom, I get red. If I do top N, I get the bottom 20 items or the top 20 items. I've got custom error messaging. I can use a spin button. So we have a much more user-friendly method of inputting data with custom headers, custom error messaging, custom coloring, and each of these individual skills can be used in an unlimited number of scenarios. It would be great if you could use all of these in a single project, but it's likely you're only going to use certain elements that I used in my project in yours. But take away what you will and use as many as you can. Don't forget to download this file from the link in the video description. You can use the starter file and work with me through the video, or just look at the solution file to see how everything was built. Remember, all of the notes are included here so you can see every single thing that I did, every formula I wrote, every conditional formatting that I applied. And leave a comment down in the video description. Let me know what you think about all this. Maybe you've got some better ways we could have jazzed this up. Put that down there too. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. We really appreciate it. This video is a little longer than most, but that's because the learning never stops.